For you guys, is it
All
nose
right.
first and then throat?
COVID was different all three times that I had it. It was different every time, and it was always weird. And that's why I knew it was COVID because I was like, this is weird. I don't know what the fuck this is.
I got it earlier this year, so it just basically felt like getting hit by a truck. I'm guessing I'm immune now. I didn't get tested. So if it is COVID, it's like very mild now, probably because I only got 2 vaccines and
Or you got one of the software updates to
Yeah.
the
What did
COVID?
you?
yeah.
Whenever I get a cold, I always get like sore throat where it kind of hurts to swallow first, then followed by nose, followed by cough. That's always a cold, and that's exactly what I had now.
Well, let's move on from this because
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I can't imagine a more boring podcast topic than the progression of symptoms of an illness.
I know, I know.
Opening banter.
I just got back from Portugal. There's some banter.
How was that?
Heyo.
I went to see Taylor Swift.
How was the
Yay.
concert?
I think it was fine.
It was fine.
Yeah, I don't think it was mind blowing or anything. But I don't know exactly if it was like great or good or bad because I don't
Yeah.
really have a rubric of what a really amazing show would look like in this kind of genre. I think I kind of expected it to be a little bit more considering it's the biggest tour in history.
Was the production impressive? Like the fire, was there like fire and sparks and shit?
Yeah, I mean, not.
Good concert.
I've never really been to a stadium tour. Actually, that's not true. I went to the stadium tour of Kendrick Lamar and Travis Scott. And like Travis Scott, even as an opening act, was on this bird, like a giant mechanical bird, and it flew all around the stadium. But there was none of that. It was just like projections. Nothing really pushed the envelope that I could tell.
Wait, why is it called a stadium tour? Is that different from a tour?
Yeah, it's a stadium tour if they perform in like a. This one was in a football stadium,
Oh,
but if they came to like Scotiabank or Rogers Center, basically you just have to be super popular enough to fill up a stadium.
oh, I see. Big stadiums, right?
Anyway,
Lots of fans.
it was half the price to fly to Portugal, stay there for a few days, Airbnb in Lisbon, and fly back was about the price of one ticket in Toronto at Rogers Center.
Oh shit, really? That's crazy.
And you know what it is? It's the resale laws because there's some sort of cap on resale tickets in the EU, which is that's kind of some good necessary consumer protection. That's kind of what you hope a government does. But
Oh, okay. So unless you
yeah.
want to sell it on like the deep black market, but like,
Maybe
yeah.
it's different here too. I hear like Ticketmaster pretty much just owns everything. It's all become like very centralized.
Well, it's kind of crazy to think that that like the prices were so expensive here that you could literally afford a trip to fucking Portugal and still go for the same price. That's insane.
Have you guys been like the plane tickets are not very expensive. It was like $3,000 for one ticket at Rogers Center
Okay.
Oh, God.
And how much was the one ticket in Portugal?
for the concert.
Yeah, the concert.
Yeah,
I
just
think
the
it was
concert.
like €400 or 300
Okay.
euro.
Okay. Right.
Oh my
Okay. I see.
God.
I didn't buy it. I didn't look. I'm not the only person in my life. Okay, I didn't go for me.
Yeah. I feel like maybe they were maybe the audience was gathering that when your response to my question was it was fine.
Really? It would cost like 3,000 to see her at Rogers Stadium?
I think that's what the tickets are going for. The American tickets are going for 10 G's.
Jeez. How much was the Zizek Peterson debate tickets? They were getting up there too.
That was like 300.
Definitely nowhere close to Taylor Swift.
Anthropologically, it was very interesting. Well, it wasn't actually interesting. It was exactly what you'd expect. The Swiftie in its natural environment. And there is really a puzzle to me about Taylor Swift's fame that I don't know, it might be worth looking into because she's getting up there for like the most popular music artist to have ever lived almost, probably somewhere around there. I don't really get it. Like not good.
Well, I do have a
not
theory
bad.
about this slightly. Like I have like it's
What is it?
tangential. It's more just like about the monoculture and the and like the fractured subcultures. And I think that like when we were little, like there was a monoculture where like there were like pop stars who like everyone knew about and everyone heard on the radio, like Michael Jackson or and that's kind of ended a little bit. Like now with kind of all these subcultures, people are in their own little sub world, and I feel like to some extent maybe the reason why like maybe Taylor Swift is like one of the last who kind of has this like mass appeal, but like even so, like she clearly doesn't. It's not quite the same. Like I mean, when we were younger, it's like everyone would have heard Michael Jackson songs. Everyone would have heard. I don't know. I'm sure. Why am I'm failing to think of like another example? But
I was
Blink 182. That was on all the radio stations.
That was on all the radio stations, and it's like even now, like I don't even know. I mean, I don't even know what Taylor Swift's new album's called, what any of her songs. I actually don't think I could name a single song by Taylor Swift. Maybe one. I'd have to think hard about it.
What about Shake It Off?
Yeah,
Shake
sure.
It Off.
If I would have thought about
like
that
that
long
one.
enough, I would have figured that one out. But
she's gonna be like Madonna. She's got staying power.
but that's my point. Is like I think maybe she has something that like that kind of bygone era of monoculture pop stars has that is sort of disappearing, and maybe that's why.
It's not the music. I can tell you that.
Maybe.
I mean, the music's just basic.
When you go into a stadium and there's like 50,000 people that know every word to every song, I mean, I don't want to be like, oh, this is bullshit because I don't really know anything about music enough to say that, but it's not that good. And you can pick out like all the boyfriends and dads because they're the only ones not singing along. And there's like,
Right.
It's like a ratio of 1 to 30.
So I'm guessing that you would make eye contact one of those, and then you guys would just both kind of like nod at each other politely, just like, Yep.
Yeah, that happened when I was going for beer in the middle of the concert, in the middle of the songs, because no Swiftie would leave to miss a song.
right,
Oh, never.
of course.
By the old water cooler.
You know, the domestic beer in Portugal, it's above average.
I'm sure that doesn't surprise me.
It's better than ours.
Well, that's good.
I'm sure it is.
Anyway, I'm not the target demographic, but whatever she's doing, it's working. So respect for that.
Yeah.
I would love to do a hyper real report on Taylor Swift because I don't know what the whole thing is. But anyway, today we do something even more unexpected than the hyper real report on Taylor Swift, which is we cover a woman on the Pill Pod.
Hey.
I wasn't gonna say it. I'm glad you did.
Ah, well, it's true.
We cover one of the second sex. 1947, Ethics of Ambiguity. I always wanted to look at this.
Pre-second sex.
It was before that, yeah. I wanted to look at this. I mean, first of all, Victor picked it, so good pick.
Yeah.
But I always wanted to look at this era and see what this existentialist stuff, the radical freedom, blah, 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 the stuff we know and love from existentialism, these people all lived through like Nazi-occupied Vichy Paris. So I think you can see some harkens back to that in this paper.
For sure.
Yeah. It's kind of a strange era. We're used to like post 60s, but like, yeah, 40s philosophy, 50s philosophy. What was going on then? Yeah, we know existentialism was huge. But
Well,
like,
I mean,
what
so
else?
phenomenology of perception was also published in 1945, I believe. So it's like that era. I mean,
Yeah, so you had
in my opinion,
phenomenology.
maybe in my favorite era of philosophy, actually, I would say, because like I'm all about existentialism and phenomenology. So for me, this is like the prime time.
Yeah.
You're for
Yeah, I just assumed.
before they got weird.
I'm for before they got weird. Like to me, I think what I love so much about this book, which I actually had never really sat down and read, and we only did the first two parts of it, which is about half the book, and I'm hoping that I can persuade you guys to do another episode on the second half because I do want to read it. But what I like about it so much is I think like it does a really good job of describing a lot of the things we talk about like, whenever we've talked about self-help philosophy or like meaningfulness in life or whatever, nihilism, I think it describes like the arguments for that, the account of that really well. And then it's like kind of trying to answer the question head on, which is like, how should you act given that like there's no meaning in the world, that like you can't, capture it. And at the time Simone DeBeauvoir is clearly responding to a lot of people who are questioning existentialism, right? They're like, well, what is this philosophy of nihilism? Like, are you good? You guys are just like a bunch of LARPers in like your dark, I don't know, turtlenecks being all depressive,
Yeah.
And she's kind of trying to answer that directly and say, well, no, like actually it's a pretty positive philosophy. It's like it's a way of trying to recover some kind of affirmative way of living in the world, which also doesn't fall victim to that. And I think what it does so well in the second part, especially, is kind of describe the archetypes, like 3 archetypes of like what people imagine an existentialist would be like kind of this brooding, like individual person. And I think she does a good job of responding to that, but maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but that's what I like about this. And I guess just to add real quick, just quickly to the point about, before they got weird, I think to me, what I think I continue to find so appealing and nourishing, I would say, about existentialism is like it's not just like giving this broad description of like the state of things where you're just like, ooh, structure is this, and it's like, okay, like so what? Like what I like about it is it gets to the nitty-gritty of like our human condition, like what we're all facing, and like says, talks about what are some possible ways of reacting to it. It's like, it's without being, this abstract ethical system like a Kantianism. It's just, it's providing some kind of nourishing way of like, yeah, maybe I should look at life this way, but still accepts, I think, all the kind of basic philosophical vision of the world that the 3 of us probably broadly share. But it's not just like, I don't know, no offense, I know you guys love systems theory and all that stuff, and I'm not saying it's wrong, but it's just like, okay, you're just like describing these interlinking things. It's like, so what? It's like, what about like what it's like to be a human? I don't know. Like to me, that's the most fundamental question.
Where's the nastiness? Yeah.
Where's the nastiness? So like that's what excites me about it.
The insight of the systems theory into what it's like to be a human is more like you might think that you're acting as a human, but you're actually wrong about what you feel.
Sure.
Maybe that's okay.
But that's just like I mean, I don't necessarily see that as actually in strong opposition with this, but maybe you would disagree.
We haven't talked about ethics.
Oh, this is very humanistic too.
Yeah. That's true. We haven't talked about ethics. That's what I like about it too, because it's true that even Sartre in like Being in Nothingness, I don't know that he like tries to answer the question from an ethical perspective, and that's why I like what Simone DeBeauvoir is trying to do here.
She addresses that book also. Says he was getting to the ethics at the end, but he didn't finish it. So here I am. I'm going to finish it for him.
Yeah, developing out the ethics.
One of the greatest romances in philosophy, Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, of course.
And plus, existentialism was a big project. There's a lot of others involved in that too, like Merleau-Ponty.
Yeah,
another big name there. Camus, yeah. But they all kind of didn't see eye to eye. It seems like at least Sartre had fallings out with both Camus and Ponty.
Yeah, big time.
Yeah, I'm surprised that you came out so strongly for this, Victor, because we didn't cover existentialism except in Merleau-Ponty's reactions to existentialism.
Yeah.
And they're kind of dealing with some of the same things. And I think Merleau-Ponty's answer to questions about freedom is kind of better.
I think that he articulates it in a more accurate way. But I think that there's actually quite a lot of compatibility here. I just think it's a point of emphasis, in my opinion, about like how they emphasize the story. But
and what else is going on in the continental scene? Post-Kantianism. I guess you have sort of logical positivism in England.
This is one of the big famous philosophy fights. The interpersonal spats was Merleau-Ponty and Sartre, and Camus and Sartre. Sartre.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not going to say it because it's too
whatever.
Yeah.
All right. But anyway, we're here back at the dialectics of recognition, which we've covered, feels like a lot of times. Anyway, PillPod 12, PillPod 70 are the 2 main ones. And they're like interpretations of Hegel. So Hegel comes up a lot in this text, but not like real Hegel. It's mostly just phenomenology of spirit, since that's what, what's his name, was teaching. Kojève.
I felt a lot of echoes of Schopenhauer in here too.
I was surprised because we did an episode on Schopenhauer like 2 weeks ago. They never mention him by name, but it feels like they're completely ripping him off.
Well, I also felt the same way about Nietzsche too. Like I don't know that she mentioned Nietzsche here explicitly.
No, she mentioned Kierkegaard we called him a proto-existentialist as well. Just brief mention. But yeah, no, this focus on sort of death and the sort of underbelly of human life seems to be kind of this development in the Yeah, with
Well,
Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche.
Meaning,
yeah, and yeah,
power, authority. Although, like Schopenhauer is a completely different answer to this question. But before we get ahead of ourselves, ethics of ambiguity. What is ethics? It doesn't seem like it's radically changed here. Just what do you do? How should you do stuff?
mhm.
Like
And then
good life,
ambiguity.
happiness.
Oh, well, I think she says it's specifically not about happiness, doesn't she?
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. Yeah.
But then ambiguity is a term that hasn't really caught on, but it's used in kind of a technical sense here, which has to do with an attitude towards a future or the future. And the ambiguous future is kind of the way that you should be making decisions in the present. And the present is the only thing that matters because it's the only thing that exists, which goes way back to the original existentialist, St. Augustine.
Yeah,
There's ambiguity. There's a lot of like paradoxes and like kind of opposite. I don't want to say like feelings, but that's almost what it seems like. She talks about feeling one way and feeling another way. And the references to Hegel seem to sort of mediate the thinking about ambiguity a lot, like oppositional kinds of forces, paradoxes, like being a pure internality against external power versus like feeling yourself, crushed by the weight of things outside of you and having no interiority. Like there's all these sorts of opposites that are all bundled up.
yeah, and also
And
the transcendence versus like facticity, like the fact that you're, conditioned by your conditions, and then like also the seeming possibility of being able to transcend, and like, and I think it's just those paradoxes that make the human condition fundamentally ambiguous, I think.
yeah, and like everyone who does ethics tries to just eliminate sort of one side of this messy, complicated what it is to be humanness, and give you a sort of ethics based on just a kind of optimism, or like Schopenhauer, pessimism, right? Starting with pure pessimism and giving you an ethics based on that. And
Or
like
rational
this,
duty.
yeah, rational duty, or sort of, I guess, irrationality with the sort of emotions and the romanticism. Yeah, and ambiguity is supposed to give like fulsome treatment of all of these oppositions. Also, like, dualism, and like privileging the mind over the body, or the body over the mind, or trying to melt away the dualism into a substance monism. She kind of lays all this out in the beginning, goes through all these sort of contradictory elements that we have to build an ethics on all of this, which is the ambiguity of being alive, existence.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it starts with all the things that existentialist ethics is not. And we
Yeah.
mentioned a few of them. And I think it's supposed to be a dialectic instead of a dual. But there's all these dualisms set up. And I think her main gripe with most ethical systems that have ever been made are that they have some sort of external, which is one of the main dualisms that is used here. So the main one is God, of course. You do what's good is good because God said so, and we're over that one. But then all the other ones somehow like follow the same pattern, like utilitarian ethics says if the end is good, then even if you did something bad on the way to get to the good end, then it's a wash in the end. So she goes through a whole bunch of histories of ethical systems, and kind of ends up with this. No, you need like a presentist internal moment decision that doesn't have to do like ends justify the means won't work because the ends are ambiguous. That's where that ambiguity term comes in. You can't know in the moment whether it's ethical or not, and what matters is the moment because you never know what the future's going to be. So and she calls out the Marxists. Very interesting in how hard she is on Marxism, considering this is 1947, immediately post World War II. And she's got a lot of stuff to say about Stalin, which Jean-Paul Sartre was
That must have come up in part 3, eh?
Oh, I
I don't
guess so.
remember.
Yeah.
I don't remember Stalin coming
Yeah,
up.
because she only mentions Lenin in the beginning part, and she mentions Marxism, but she seems to sort of exclude Marx from these references too, saying, Marx would never say this, but Marxism, as in like sort of post-Marx, classical Marxism,
She's
is,
got the gun out for certain Marxists, and here's why: because they do an ends justify the means thing. Say, if you have to guillotine a few landlords, it's okay because we'll bring in the revolutionary state. And that's not going to fly here because it's not a present ethics. It doesn't work in the present. And sorry, I did skip ahead. So later on,
Well, she also targets. I mean, one person you didn't mention that I thought was also looming huge here is like Kantian ethics too, which she's like, very,
Yeah.
very like very aggressively attacks, I would say.
Yeah, for sure. Yo, Victor, while you're at it, could you explain what deontology is?
So deontology, right?
The
It's like using
rational.
Yeah, it's using like our rational, like the fact that we are rational agents and like we have to, we have these maxims, these categorical imperatives, right? I don't know if I should go through all four formulations of it, but it's basically like, you have to treat people as means, or sorry, as ends in themselves rather than a means
Yeah.
to some end. And like, if you have to will a maxim as if it was going to apply to everybody
Yeah.
equally,
That's the
universally, right?
universalizing element.
The universe. So, and like the idea there is like, because we're rational agents, like somehow like through reason we figure out and we realize, oh yeah, like we have to do this. And it's like, and his whole goal is very much to like separate, to like achieve what he calls pure practical reason, which is really to like eliminate facticity, meaning like our embodied situational contingent point of view, and find a purely rational point of view on which to say, oh yeah, like it doesn't matter like what your desires are, what your facticity is. You have to always do this because it's the rational thing to do. You have to follow the categorical
your
imperative.
Duty.
Your duty bound to do that. And I think like obviously this is like totally opposed to this like attendance to ambiguity, to the human condition, which is all about that fleshy stuff, right? That Kant is trying to eliminate, right? Kant's trying to eliminate all that stuff, right? Although that facticity, and just have a universal pure, what he calls pure practical reason, right? About like what we should do. So, this is obviously she's going to be very opposed to it. I would say like she definitely targets utilitarianism too, because it's kind of doing the same thing. But I would say like, if anything, I see Kant as like the villain of ethics extraordinaire for Beauvoir.
Well, just to sum up the similarity between them all, God is external to your life. So if you do what he says, that's like imposing an externality. Kant does the same thing with reason, just says, well, follow reason and you'll be ethical. That's also an external, what do you call it, impingement. And Marxist with the, everything's justified as long as the revolution happens in the future, then you're imposing the future as this external justification. So all three, the objection to all three are the same objection.
It's the deterministic part of Marx that seems to be the external. It's like your situation in society that decides how you think, whether you're part of the bourgeoisie or the working class. She kind of says, your choices, when you make these choices, right, which is a fundamental part of ethics, is like choosing, right? Those are sort of determined for you by your situation in society. And so it's external. It's externalist. And she doesn't want to be overly internalist, but yeah, that's the ambiguity part again. All these contradictory elements need to be balanced. And interesting, like Kant comes up in a discussion of evil too, right? Like this idea that, well, ancient wisdom, right? No one is willfully bad. Like nobody wills evil. Evil is sort of the equivalent of falling into error. And one of the lines I really liked was existentialism alone gives a real role to evil. And it is this perhaps which makes its judgment so gloomy. Because, yeah, evil is something that existentialist ethics takes seriously, apparently. Well, these other ones do not. They sort of explain it away as a privation of the good.
Well, and they're all cop-outs, right? If you give up the ethicalness of your decisions in the moment, either to God or to reason or to the future, then you're not bearing the responsibility that you have for the choices that you make. So she's pretty clear on this, that existentialist ethics is actually the only real ethics, because it's the only one that puts the burden of the decision on you instead of to these other different places.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way of putting it. I mean, at times early in the book, I felt that she was kind of, I didn't see her attacking Marx fully, but at some point, or at some points more like the way that Marxism is taken up. Like, for example, she talks about like, the Marxist who tries to distinguish, well, this is actually quoting her. She says, if one pretends to distinguish the real proletariat from a treacherous proletariat, or misguided or unconscious or mystified one, then it is no longer a flesh and blood proletariat that one is dealing with, but the idea of a proletariat, one of those ideas which Marx ridiculed. So it seems like she's, kind of pointing to these ways of thinking of like turning like Marxism into like this abstract ideal, as opposed to, I guess, attending to flesh and blood situations. And at other times, it seems like she's talking about moments when revolution is motivated, which reminded me of Merleau-Ponty's talk about revolution, which we talked about on some episode back. You might have actually mentioned the episode, which is that like, revolution happens when you're responding to a particular situation. And that's another thing she emphasizes, like,
Yeah.
ethics is like a particular situation that like leads you to a decision point, and that there's like no escaping the specificity of those situations as like being moments of choice and action, as opposed to like kind of knowing in advance sort of like how these things are going to happen or how they're supposed to happen.
Like ethics is like a universal formula.
I did not mention that episode, but it's called, I believe, Phenomenological Marxism.
Yeah, we should always distinguish Marx and Marxism, or at least when someone's talking about Marxism, you should ask, what Marxism are we talking about here? And there's usually some kind of tradition of Marxism that they're discussing. I mean, they were members of the French Communist Party. There were dogmatic Marxists. There was the Western Marxist tradition. There was the Marxist Leninism, and then there was Stalinism. There's a lot of different takes. And it's still ongoing, the research today on Marx himself. So, I mean, yeah.
She's pretty clear that this is not Marx himself. It's Marxisms, and then taking the proletariat as a class to be a decision maker. Whereas existentialism, of course, is no, only individuals make decisions. So you can speak of the proletariat as a bunch of individual decision makers, but you can't speak of it as one class making distinct or decisions, which I think, I've heard a lot of Marxists who kind of disagree with that. But then you have to add all these explanations in that we've talked about before. Oh, they're unconscious. Oh, they're steeped in ideology. That's why they're not making the right decisions.
Yeah, exactly.
And then she goes through, I found this funny, the different versions of the proletariat, the German proletariat versus the American proletariat. And the American proletariat is just, you give them sports and new cars and fridges, and they're just they're just gonna be chill forever. So they're done.
Exactly.
That's the proletariat in the imperial core, the proletariat who gets all of the handouts because of the benefits of imperialism, which is
1947. So this goes way back. But anyway, the thing about existentialism is like, you cannot eschew responsibility, even if there's all these other causes that we could speak about, like, I don't know, psychoanalysis or repression or whatever. No matter what causes lead up to a decision, you still make a decision. And her feeling is that many versions of Marxism put that to the wayside and just put you in a class. So the class is deciding for you, which isn't in her mind, the real human experience, which is nuts and bolts down to it. What do you do in the moment as yourself without being able to give responsibility to
I mean, I think that also it's important to emphasize, the vision of freedom here, which I think, it can be caricatured, existentialist freedom, as being like this really intense agential freedom. But I think that's like a little bit of a misreading, even in Sartre. Like, I think that it's emphasizing the responsibility, being confronted with situations like flesh and blood situations. I think that's the emphasis. but like the kind of rational, agential decision maker, that kind of agent, I don't think existentialists believe in. That's why they say, they talk about facticity being like, they acknowledge you're going to be conditioned by the situation that you're in, right? And like, but within that situation, you still have responsibility in those very, very difficult situations. And I will say that that's maybe also one of the things that I find most refreshing about existentialism, especially in the context of other sort of later continental thought, which sort of gave up on freedom altogether. I don't know. I don't know if I can say something specific about like how they're all consistent, but I do think that existentialism is still consistent with all the things we talk about on this podcast, whether it's like Baudrillard or like Lacan, the fact that we're influenced by all these different things. I don't know that existentialism. I mean, maybe I'm being like overly apologetic to existentialism. There probably are some disagreements, but I don't take them to be like believing in this like really like free in the rationally free sense, right? It's much more of just like hey, you're in these situations, but there's always like a little moment of responsibility and choice in no matter how constrained you are. And I find that vision appealing.
I think it's always easy to slip into a kind of one-sidedness when you're coming up with existential theories, right? Like it's always easy to emphasize one thing over another thing. Like even when it comes to freedom, right? Like freedom comes with responsibility. Freedom comes with, duties towards other people. But some people think about freedom as just being, free to do whatever you want, like a kind of formal freedom with no content, where you can just kind of choose anything and it becomes very arbitrary. And then there's the emphasis that goes the other way too. Like, no, freedom is like, something that the laws give us and the state, and then it becomes a kind of very unfree kind of freedom. She's always trying to balance these different elements, even with the choice thing, right? Like I always go back to kind of the beginning part just because it kind of gives you a little bit of a roadmap to everything she's going to say. And one thing she says, we were saying every choice is like in a moment, and in the moment you're sort of taking on that choice, that freedom by the root almost. But she does say, at every moment he can grasp the non-temporal truth of his existence. So non-temporal, but then between the past, which no longer is, and the future, which is not yet, this moment when he exists is nothing. The feeling that there's this like radical presentism, but then that moment is kind of just nothing, just sort of this knife edge sandwiched between the past and the future.
Yeah.
What I got out of that is like, if you go down far enough into any individual decision, or even like yourself, what you think of yourself as, if you break it down far enough, there's nothing there, which is kind of where existentialism gets its absurd quality from. But
yeah, I get
it's
that
almost
too.
like you don't have to accept that there's nothing there, because eventually you're going to be making a ton of decisions, and the people around you are making decisions. And at a certain point, everyone can agree, and not because of some external imposition, but everyone can agree like oppression is worse than freedom. Like you can get to a statement like that, but not from without. You can only get to it from like compounding life experience. Are we saying something different there, or
what I thought you were then saying is almost like, since they don't really, existentialists don't really believe in like human nature, right? That existence is almost like an ongoing project of becoming what you are, of like becoming the being that you're supposed to be.
right?
So human nature isn't just sort of something given. So you are shaped by external forces. You're thrown into this world that's not of your making. Heideggerian thrownness, or even like the Marxist line on that. But then in a sense, there is an important subjective component that those external forces don't touch. And that's where choices come from. So you're not completely determined also by these external or objective forces that shape you as well. That there is sort of freedom there as well. But that freedom isn't, again, it's not just given there. It also depends on the objective and the determining, because like freedom would have no meaning if there weren't impediments and limits and obstacles.
Okay, I think we might be saying the same thing. So
Yeah.
basically, every decision you make is a step towards becoming yourself, but yourself is a corpse ultimately.
Mhm.
Every step you take is towards your death, and every time you take a step, the horizon retreats just as far as the decision you made. So you can never be anything, which is the point of the Being and Nothingness book. And then I think this is an apologetic. Like, I think she's responding to critics because she says,
Oh yeah.
this
Yeah.
makes every step way more important. This doesn't mean this doesn't make the world meaningless. It makes every step almost supremely important because you can always make the wrong step. And ultimately, it's a wash at the end of your life because you're a corpse and you disappear. But if you can agree on certain things, like oppression is bad, if you have enough a life experience, you're going to learn oppression is bad, then that's going to determine the choices that you make. So this is a little bit abstract at this point, but it comes down to, or it comes to the real world when she's speaking of resistance and political resistance, and not siding with the PCF's take on the Soviet Union, for example, or supporting the resistance in Algeria. And she did a bunch of photo ops with Che Guevara and all that stuff. So you kind of see it cashing out in that way. That's like, if we take dogmatically, if we take individual choice and individuals as having freedom as the true nature of the world, then the best way to cohere with that is to give as many subjects as much choice as possible. Is that fair enough to say?
Yeah, I mean,
Just as like an overview.
I mean,
It'll
that
never tell
sounds-
you what to do in the moment, but it gives you the overall plan for humanity, which means sometimes you give up on the Communist Party if the Communist Party is being a bunch of assholes.
Yeah, I mean that definitely, I think maybe that comes through like more explicitly in part 3, which I didn't read, but yeah, I mean that sounds right to me. She also like, so there's that point, there's that kind of question about like, I guess we could say like global ethics, not in the sense of like global, but I just mean like intersubjective ethics. And then like I think there's also kind of a strong account, which I really always enjoy, which kind of harkens back to Nietzsche, I feel like, and maybe to some extent Kierkegaard, just talking about kind of at the individual level, right? Like, what should you do, or like what are the things that, and it seems like for her it's just like, make choices that are deliberate to some extent, right? I mean, I like the part when she says, there's no more obnoxious way to punish a man than to force him to perform acts which make no sense to him. Just like try to find things that make sense to you, right? Which is kind of the classic, I guess, existentialism. Just like, find your true self, but like not in like the stupid way, I guess. Because, she does the classic existentialist move where it's like, you kind of she talks about freedom and how like there's a horror to freedom, right? Like when you realize you're responsible, right? That's actually terrifying. You're just like, holy shit, like it's my choices. I can't be in bad faith and blame external things. It's like, I always already have some kind of choice. And then she said, okay, well, salvation, I guess, is, only possible, this is quoting her, if despite obstacles and failures, a man preserves the disposal of his future, if the situations open up more possibilities to him. In case his transcendence is cut off from his goal, or there is no longer any hold on objects which might give it a valid content, his spontaneity is dissipated without founding anything. So I guess that's what you want to avoid, right? You want to avoid feeling like there's no point in doing anything, I guess, and just like, I don't know, I feel like
that would be the one-sidedness of giving in to the absurdity and
Exactly.
despairing. Because
Yeah.
like existentialism has that face, she says. It is a kind of a philosophy of the absurd and the despair. And she says it encloses man in a sterile anguish, in an empty subjectivity, and it's incapable of furnishing him with any principle for making choices. Let him do as he pleases. But then she says, but in that case, the game is lost. right?
Yeah.
And then she quotes Sartre saying, "Man is a useless passion." And then she goes on to sort of ask, well, then what does useless and usefulness mean in this situation, in at this level of description? It means something to do with like the life project, the existentialist life project. So she's always sort of reversing the meaning of existentialism and then exploring that side,
Exactly.
absurdity and despair. Yeah, like we're making choices moment to moment and we're sort of overcoming ourselves, overcoming any sort of static sense of
Yeah.
our being because we exist and we're sort of becoming what we should become, which is our choice. But each choice doesn't sort of completely negate what came before. What came before, in a way, remains what it is and doesn't just become a stepping stone to the next choice. Each choice has a kind of importance in itself.
Am I the only one who found this kind of unconvincing? Because it's almost like having your cake and eating it too. If it's all a wash at the end anyway, then are you really going to choose the path of most resistance? Because that's kind of the equivalence being made here. If you want to live the good life, it's resistance to oppression, but also, you're going to die and it's going to be over and who cares? And this is a weird situation that we're stuck in. But fighting or resisting is also a hell of a lot of effort. And it's not very rewarding either.
The resisting part, I mean, maybe that's like a kind of political message, but I guess at the individual level, I mean, I read it more as being like, kind of taking ownership. We're like our childhood kind of turns us into victims of feeling like there are, these stable external rules that like mean something, right? That like, we can just follow these things and kind of like absolve ourselves of responsibility because when we're children, we have all these people, kind of making decisions for us. And we're just like, oh, well, that's the way the world's supposed to be. And then when we become adults, we all get traumatized by the fact that like, we realize that's all phony. And like, oh no, everyone's just making these choices
Yeah.
themselves, kind of. And like, and then, and like, it's like the people who are in bad faith kind of continually try to recover that feeling, that childish feeling of feeling like there's like other decisions.
Yeah. Sorry. That part that I just got out of like the purpose of life becomes
Is from chapter 3.
There's a whole section called freedom and liberation. So
Right.
Anyway, yeah, maybe saving that for another time. But that's what I found. I felt like you're just trying to justify everything you believe with a kind of schematic that doesn't really necessitate that. But going back to the childhood thing, because that's what we were supposed to read for today, not the rest of the book.
Yeah.
But it's basically the evidence that God doesn't exist is that we have to be children first, because being a child is like the best world, and then the whole rest of your life is just downhill from there.
I mean, I don't know if she says it that way exactly. I think she just says that like
She starts the second part off saying, man's unhappiness, quoting Descartes, is because of having been a child.
Yeah,
And
because you're unhappy.
again,
this is like a Schopenhauer quote, basically. Like you start and everything's awesome, but then everything only gets worse forever, and suffering only increases.
I also thought it was because the moral universe is one that man creates. But as a child, you come into this world that you don't create. You come into this world that is like alien to you, and you have all these authority figures around you. And as a kid, right? Like think about how you looked at your parents or your older siblings or any authority figures, right? You think like, wow, they're such like complete people, totally self-possessed. They're in the language here, like they have being, right? Like they have fullness, they have being. And you look at yourself and you're sort of nothing there. You have no being. And you grow up and you're supposed to take on these responsibilities. You're told, you have to take responsibility for your own life, and you can never really do it. You always feel like there's this like thing you should do or this way you should be, and like you're always doubting yourself. And it seems like this sort of experience of childhood, it puts the seeds of unhappiness in us because we have this sort of distant memory of all of these sort of super self-possessed people, all
Well,
these
also I think
models that stay with us and we can never quite live up to.
also like the fact that parents tend to be so, like not authoritarian necessarily, but like parents also tell you what to do. And in a way, like I think parents, and I was reflecting on like my own parents and just like watching other people who have kids now and like parenting in general. And I think there can be a tendency to kind of, to be like, well, that's just the way it is because I told you so. Right. And it's like, that's what you're doing. And like you kind of get these black and white, you can sometimes in moments get these black and white answers from parents because it's like a lot more work from a parenting perspective to be like, well, it's actually nuanced and like I'm making this choice and like explaining to them, right? So it's like, so if you're a child and you had parents who were just kind of giving you black and white answers, it's like I think I felt like she was specifically talking about like that kind of childhood that then you go out into the world and you're expecting to be able to kind of have like these definitive answers to things that are going to make sense to you because you're like, well, I had parents telling me what I was supposed to do. So that's why afterwards you kind of like some people replace it with God or other things, or like they get really serious about their ethics or their like, or their commitments to things when she's talking about the serious man, right? The kind of like person who's tries to escape like freedom, like the kind of burden, the terrible burden of freedom by looking to external authorities, right? By treating these goals as absolute, by being like, oh, I got to make more money. I got to like look out, like pursue this career that like is objectively important. And like, you're all serious about life. And, I was thinking about that book, which I never read, but it's like this like self-help book called like The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, which I've read about, but haven't read it. And like, really like there, the point is not so much like literally not giving a fuck about anything, but like also just not taking things so seriously. Like, not being so anxious about these things that like don't matter that much. Like you can just kind of like do the things that speak to you without being a dick. And just like the people who are all like worried about what other people think of them and all these things, they're taking life up so seriously. And I kind of see what Beauvoir is talking about here with the serious man as a kind of bad faith where you're, because it's safer, it feels safer to be like, okay, well, these are the things that society told me matter. So I'm going to take them up and I'm going to be really serious about them. But then when they don't go your way, then you're anxious and you're all like worried and you're so miserable. And it's like, really like this shit that this world is made of, all these ideas are like contingent and don't matter. And you don't have to take them seriously. And you can kind of like laugh at them and just like do the things that matter to you and not worry about like all this. I mean, easier said than done, but I think that's kind of the message that I saw there.
Yeah, I think I'm starting to see why she's talking about ambiguity and sort of the one-sidedness of ethical theories. Because yeah, you can emphasize not giving a fuck and sort of say to people, well, don't let thing, but obviously like you have to care about things too. There are things
But
you
you can't not
won't
care.
have a
Yeah.
choice. Yeah, you won't have a choice in some cases. In other cases, you got to commit yourself. You can't just sort of float through life with no commitments because that's also bad. So like ambiguity is always about balancing these opposites. And she says, existentialism defined itself from the beginning as a philosophy of ambiguity. And then she cites Sartre saying, man is that being whose being is not to be, right? So it's like the being is not to be. That's where existence comes in because you're always moving towards being, but you're never quite getting there, right?
Exactly.
You deny yourself being in order to be. Like, life is life is a project. It's ongoing. It's never really finished. But then if you just look at it that way and say, well, if it's never going to be finished, then what's the point? Well, then you're like sort of sliding into one side and you're going to be, experience angst or unhappiness or something like that. You always have to sort of tarry with the ambiguity here. And again, like when she says passion, that what I was brought up earlier, useless passion, like has sort of a religious connotation of making yourself into a god and then sort of rising above all of the messiness. Man's is a useless passion that he tries in vain to realize the synthesis of the for oneself and the in oneself to make himself a god. There's no
Yeah.
you underneath all of it. There's just a sort
Yeah.
of
There's no easy answers, but
becoming, right? A becoming what you are and never quite getting there. So yeah, I get the pills was saying like having your cake and eating it too, a little bit as well though, because
Yeah,
it's
I see that too.
always like always both sides, always everything being balanced against each other, sort of never really, getting there, but also seeing the value in never getting there. Like it always kind of turns back on itself.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. That's a good. It does do that. It
Well,
does do that, and it is like,
this also gives like supreme value to something like sacrificing your life for a cause. For example, what is it? Right at the beginning, she mentions these two events. She's like, there's Stalingrad and Buchenwald, I believe.
yeah,
Yeah.
Buchenwald's a concentration camp. And just based on
Yeah.
the context, she's like saying that these two are opposite events. Stalingrad, whatever our conceptions of it now, I think she's speaking of it in like, this was a supreme event of human self-sacrifice in order to defeat Nazism. So Stalingrad is a heroic
One of the
event.
biggest battles.
Yeah, and she goes on to say that Stalingrad cannot erase Buchenwald, which is a concentration camp in Germany. So Stalingrad, this heroic event. Now, reading this 80 years post hoc, my knowledge of Stalingrad comes from Call of Duty 2 and maybe like Enemy at the Gates. Was that Stalin? So anyway, look at this. 1947, Stalingrad was basically seen as the event that ended Nazism. But now, do we who play Call of Duty 2 think of this as the great event of self-conscious sacrifice that she's describing? No fucking way. The Russian officers, at least in the video game, they give the first guy a gun with 5 bullets, and then they give the next guy 5 bullets and say, pick up the gun of the guy who dies in front of you. Oh yeah, and if you retreat, we're going to shoot you with a machine gun. So look, I think here's where I could go with this, into simulation land. I don't know what happened at Stalingrad. I have no idea. But was it what she is describing as like a self-conscious sacrifice? I'm giving up my life to defeat Nazism. It could be, I don't know. But she's writing this like 5 years after it happened. She's also in Paris and a communist. We have to avoid going to Beauvoir to answer this. But at least post hoc, can you consider these different events? Like, she's talking about the atomic bomb. She's talking about concentration camps. She's talking about Stalingrad. Are these to be considered ethical events here?
Well, I don't know if she's. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I don't. Obviously, I haven't read part 3, but like, I guess the exam. I mean, she mentions those 2 examples right at the beginning, and I feel like maybe it was more like a table setting gesture to be like, this is the world we're in, where we're trying to fit, like, 1947, a few years after World War II. It's like, here's the horrors we've been confronted with, the heroism, the horrors. It's like, how do we think about the ethical universe in the context of these 2 things? I don't know if she's promising an answer to be like, oh yeah, like there were individual choices. I mean, look, like one of Sartre's very famous, I think, like statements on ethics, existential ethics, which I think comes up in Being and Nothingness, which I kind of take her to be picking up here a little bit, as like his thought experiment about, which is about World War II, right? It's like, you've got a sick mother at home, and like you're the only one able to take care of her because Europe's at war. But Europe's at war, and like maybe you could go help the war effort, right? And it's like, which one is morally correct to do, right? If you go to war, you're going to leave your sick mother, and she's not going to have anyone to take care of her. But then potentially you could be saving lives out there fighting, and it's like, what ethical system is going to tell you what the right choice is there? It's like, that's just one of those situations that you're confronted with that I don't think any of these ethical systems are really going to be much help with, and like, that's the ambiguity of it. It's like, which of those choices is right? I don't know. You have to make the choice. And like,
it's like
they're not going
to they make a virtue of the failure or the undecidability there. It's just like, you're never going to do the right thing, but that failure is sort of life too. and that failure is necessity. Because you have no right without wrong, you have no truth without falsehood.
Well, it could be this too. It could be like, okay, if you're confronted with that situation and you're like some person who is like, you know, I don't know, some weird Kantian robot who's like, okay, you know, that situation is going to drive you crazy because like you're not going to know what you're supposed to do.
Error.
Right. And it's like, or if you're like a utilitarian, you're like, well, what's going to do more good for everybody? It's like, I guess I could potentially
calculation.
I could potentially save more lives when I go to war, or I could be like, come out of the boat or come out of whatever and be the first one shot dead. And it's like my death meant nothing and did nothing. And it's like, okay. So like, so I think that maybe part of the ethics is not maybe an outcome, but it's in process, right? And it's like, if you're aware, you're like, oh yeah, shit. Like this is just one of those things that is like really ambiguous. And I just have to make a choice and like be at peace with that. Like, that's just, you know, like, and like in the ability to be aware of that, to like try to be attentive, which is effortful, be attentive to that ambiguity. You know, that's maybe why I sometimes read this as a kind of virtue ethics, because it's like a process of being like, yeah, it's true. This is a fucking impossible decision. It's like, I have to reckon with that the way that I can.
Yeah, it does seem like maybe not virtue ethics fully, like a Catholic Aristotelianism, but it does seem to be clear, at least in subtext, that a conscious choice is much better than a passive choice, much better than habit, much better than being told what to do. If you sit there and kind of put this burden on your shoulders and then make a choice, this is much more human than a Kantian robot, for example.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can really argue that, right? You can't really prove that that's better. I think it's offering you a vibe, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's probably true.
Oh, you have to take it with your own experiences and your own learning and your own commitments to things, right? And then you have to think about it in the context of your own life, right? Because even when she mentions at one point in the first part, you know, like you can give these long moral screeds to people, and Marxists often do, she says, is to like morally chastise people to get them to do what's right and sort of turn them into passive subjects and tell them what to do. But she says, isn't even just using language to talk to people, you know, bringing something out of them that's already there. They're not really passive. They're sort of either gonna, you know, take on what you say, or they're going to reject it or not hear it or withdraw or something as well. So there's always this subjectivity, this interiority that you're appealing to. You're never making someone passive. So even if you think, you know, preaching is the right way to make people more moral, well, you're sort of proving yourself wrong by doing that. She often sort of takes this tactic of argument, saying, you know, well, by thinking this, they're actually proving themselves wrong. Because if you think you can appeal to someone's morality, then that's what you're doing. You're appealing to their morality from within them. And then again, it becomes their choice to accept it or reject it.
It's nice to know that the Marxists were always annoying, because I'm pretty sure she was one, or at least a member of the French Communist Party.
Definitely.
But she says, it's curious to note that most Marxists today feel no repugnance at the edifying dullness of moralizing speeches. They do not limit themselves to finding fault with their adversaries in the name of historical realism. When they tax them with cowardice, lying, selfishness, and venality, they very well mean to condemn them in the name of a moralism superior to history. So at the very least,
that's the part I was referring to. Yeah.
At the very least, Marxists have always been this way.
Yeah.
Yeah. As a side note, glad to know that there's always been really annoying Marxists out there. Yeah.
But I mean, I think, you know, earlier I mentioned I felt like she was trying to like rescue. I think she is a Marxist, and there's signs when she like, or especially in part one, I think she tries to be like, oh, well, you know, this is real Marxist.
I did skip in that quotation. She says, and it's curious to note that most Marxists of today, unlike Marx himself.
Yeah, she pulls Marx out. She always pulls Marx out of the oven.
She does. Like, so you can tell that she wants to obviously rescue an account of Marxism. I don't know how successful it always is, but definitely she's definitely not, you know, not an anti-Marxist by any means. She just is annoyed by Marxists.
Yeah, because in like 1950, I think it was it 1950, yeah, like or maybe 1960 when Sartre is going to write that book, a critique of dialectical reasoning, and he's going to try to show what's similar about historical materialism and existential ontology and what's different. And for instance, you know, they're both materialist. They both pay attention to your situation within society in terms of class and wealth and history and all that stuff. They both pay, but then there are important differences as well, like, you know, the less determinist maybe, or like that sort of stuff too. So they're both gonna stay leftists, they're both communists, they're both Marxist, but they also sort of want to do their own thing with existentialism.
Exactly. And I think like they're very aware of like I mean, I see reading this, and I think I've mentioned before that I not too long ago read At the Existentialist Cafe, which is kind of like a historical novel of the existential tradition. You know, you can kind of see, I think, setting this like, you know, being like, yeah, we are going to support these movements at these times, right? And like, you know, you will see if you go and look at like the history of Sartre and Beauvoir, you'll see that there were moments when they like were very steadfastly supporting this movement or that movement, right? And like, and then like, I think seeing that in light of this and other stuff, you're like, oh, like they were just like making a choice at the time to be like, yeah, okay, this looks good for now. But that doesn't necessarily tell you that they're, I guess, or it would be a mistake from reading them in those times being like, you know, very
Dogmatic.
committed to a particular movement. Yeah, that they're dogmatic. Exactly. You can kind of see, I don't know. And maybe I'm sounding like an ultra apologist for the existentialists. You know, I kind of am. I mean, I feel like they nourish the shit out of me, but
nourishment's good. And we just got a couple minutes left. So I'll maybe just like I'll outline the vibe of existentialism, kind of why I don't like it that much, I guess. It's not really popular anymore, right? But what's not to like about it? And I was kind of trying to jot down some not arguments, but feelings. And I kind of got to, it doesn't really answer any of my questions because it is subjectivist. And we have this radical fundamental freedom thing. I think she argues really well in its defense. Like, no matter what other shit's going on, you're still making decisions. That's what you do as a conscious thing.
Yeah.
And even if you're ignorant to those mechanisms on their own terms, you still have to make decisions. But but to me, at least, those mechanisms of decision, they seem like a lot that you're brushing to one side. There's still language. There's still everything phenomenological that Merleau-Ponty talks about. Unconscious stuff, unconscious trauma, then biology, then habit. Like, when it comes down to it, those matter a lot when it comes to decision-making time, even if it's still a quote-unquote real decision. So maybe the decision is ultimately made, that's true, but it seems like in order to double down on this individualist, subjectivist account of freedom, you're addressing a really narrow band, and it's kind of losing a lot of the stuff that I find really interesting. I'm not looking at myself, of course, when I'm judging other people for the decisions they make. So
okay, that's really interesting. Sorry,
ultimately, I think it makes it's good as an ethics. It's up there with ethics because it doesn't need a whole bunch of external resources and actually pushes those external resources into the not mattering area. But it also gets rid of too much of the stuff that I think is important and maybe just aesthetically I like.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's helpful, I think, because, you know, in terms of just it being a matter of taste, like I do think that maybe some of that stuff that you find more interesting, I don't find as interesting. I mean, it depends on what we're talking about. Look, like, you know that I'm obviously, I mean, you mentioned Merleau-Ponty. I'm obviously a huge fan of that, and like a huge fan of psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis, you know, some of this other stuff too. But I guess I see it as two aspects of the same thing. Like, I guess when I read this, I still, at least in my mind, see it as consistent. It's like, okay, and then you could go, I mean, she even hints at it, right? When she's talking about childhood, she's talking about all these different things that affect your choices, right? It's like, she's just not fleshing it out, right? She's not like going into it, giving a philosophical account of it, but she's aware, right? She's aware, yeah, those things have an impact. It's just like not her project here. She's like, yes, 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 all that stuff. Facticity has a huge effect. And I don't know, maybe Sartre in Being a Nothingness spends more time kind of describing that stuff in a more systematic way. Maybe not. It's been a while since I've like engaged strongly, like deeply with it. But no, that's helpful. And like, I don't, I mean, I don't begrudge you for that preference, right? It's like I could see why, if like the things you're interested in are more like, giving a systematic treatment of like, I don't know, all these processes, right, that are going on behind the scenes, whether it's habit or whether it's psychology or whether it's like media or like,
Or like, why do you
yeah,
believe things that you know are false on purpose?
yeah, sure. But I mean, I do think that a lot of that stuff is implicit here and it's totally consistent with it. So like, yeah, it really is just a point of emphasis. Like, I guess, I don't know, I wonder if you disagree with this or not, Pills, but like, I feel like, and when I was reading it, I was kind of thinking about this. I was like, well, if Pills and Eric don't like this, but I was more thinking about you, Pills, like, if you don't like this, it's probably because of its point of emphasis more than it is like any claims that it's making that you like strongly disagree with. It's more just like what kind of thing is it exploring? Because I think it accepts basically the same worldview that you do.
I think it does too. However, there's a lot of decisions that are made without this like scenario of free choice, and almost all of them, I'd say, and I think you'd probably agree with me.
I do.
Almost all of the decisions you make in this mode are not ethical ones. You may make like, I don't know, one a day, one a week, could even be one a year, who knows? But these are like exceptional cases that make
Totally
that are
agree with you.
ethical decisions, and maybe that, I mean, that's fine. I don't think that is contradictory at all.
No, I totally agree with you. I think that's right. And maybe that's why for me, when I'm thinking about like a macro vision of the world through theory and philosophy, I think that I do think I do feel that existentialism is not always that much help. Where I see it as a lot of help is in the realm of what we talk about as like philosophy as self-help, or like thinking about, or even trying to articulate something like excellence. Like, I don't know, without being this like Aristotelian virtue ethicist. I feel like there's something here where you could talk about, it's like, yeah, it's actually really hard to make a deliberate choice, but here's a description of how it might be possible. Right. And it's like, and that seems good to me. That seems useful to me. So yeah, that's why I think I'm still at heart an existentialist.
I mean, I think my favorite part, I've already said kind of about the having it both ways thing and whatever. I think I like the emphasis on, despite all the ambiguities, she's really trying to think about action, which is kind of the heart of ethics, but also there's an intellectual quality to it. There's something really important about thinking and reflection, and that she doesn't want to give that up either. And in the same way, she's kind of anti-idealist, but she seems to sort of take what's best in Hegel and give a kind of materialist reading of kind of this absolute idealism, which has a lot in common, I think, with Marx's reading of Hegel and a Marxist reading of Hegel, but focusing on, action and where values come from. So, I like that the failure is at the heart of where values come from. And that, man has to realize, she says, I like this line, to attain his truth, man must not attempt to dispel the ambiguity of his being, but on the contrary, accept the task of realizing it. And I think it a lot of it does jive with my thinking a lot, because I am very circumspect and I try to see values in other traditions while being critical of them. And I see her doing that here too with Hegel and the Stoics and Kant and Plato and Spinoza and Marxism and everything. Like there's a fiercely individualistic spirit to it, but like we were saying earlier about death, like death isn't the end, because there's also, you got to think about the community. You got to think about humanity at large. But she always stops short of becoming idealist and universalizing and prescriptive. So even if I don't like some of the having your cake and eating it too kind of ways it feels sometimes, I do very much enjoy how she navigates.
Yeah, I think you've convinced me based on that. I think every philosopher should at least make an attempt to do this, because this is the hardest part.
Yeah, totally.
Not the descriptions, but
no,
layout
the
and
descriptions are a lot easier. Yeah.
All right. All right. I'm on board then.
It's a baller fucking attempt here.
It's not perfect, but it's pretty hardcore.
And I like the way she actually makes claims, and this feels like some of the best things that you see later in like post-structuralism, where they seem to resist taking a position on anything. I think she almost does that, while at the same time being much more clear and actually saying things about the real world and not retreating into this sort of highfalutin intellectualism.
Man, I'm telling you, so good.
Yeah, you don't see Foucault. Foucault writes like 1,200 pages on how clinics got made, but not one word does he have to say about how to live now.
We're all based and Beauvoir pilled here, or what?
Yeah, a little bit. I think I really like the way she makes use of the negation to say something terrifying.
Man, and there's so much other good stuff here. I wanted to talk about her takedown of nihilism, or at least attempt. She tries to like talk about the nihilist attitude. Maybe if we do another episode, which I would argue for to finish the book, we can maybe talk about that.
Yeah, I'm happy if this is just a first run at it, and I would definitely have more positive and maybe critical things to say on a second run through. But like, yeah, the way she uses the negation of the negation and then applies it to the ideas of where value comes from, and then how to put values into practice without, falling into some kind of deterministic, like we said earlier about the Marxism appealing to history for berating people into being more moral. Yeah, I'd say.
Well, I know Pills finished it, so, and it sounded like at the beginning he had some stuff to say about part 3, which the way that he articulated, I might be critical of. So I'm curious to read part 3 and see if I agree with you or not.
And I loved seeing the lingo too, like the failed absolute. That book that Zizek writes later. I mean, I feel like the core ideas are already here, and Zizek has just sort of done his thing with them. But I think she articulates it in a much more satisfying way here.
Well, we should do that then. We'll look at part 3. Part 3 brings up like science as an approach, and it also brings up the church. It brings up the USSR. So I guess we'll just cut it there, and you'll have to join us on the Patreon for that one. Oh, I don't ever do that.
Oh, shit.
I never do that. But, next week is a patron week. So,
yeah. Perfect.
That's just the way it is.
That was so great. Nourish your soul and go read some Simone DeBeauvoir. I'm telling you.
And pay us $4.
Yeah.
Or just read it yourself.
It's good stuff.
All right.
It's on Marxist.org. Go there.
That was good stuff, guys. I will end the recording and chat at you all people